So happy New Year. I was going through my emails over the holiday, and one of the things that really struck me was a question about why not just the S&P? Why don't we just all invest in the S&P and that's it? And I think this stems from when Buffett had his last will and testament. He said it's very easy to figure out my will. Put it 10% in treasuries and 90% in the S&P 500. And the reason why the S&P 500 is because it's a passive index of the most valuable global 500 companies. Now, the problem there is that's great. And actually, there's a better investment. It's called the TQQQ, which is a triple leveraged NASDAQ 100 kind of technology exchange traded fund. And it's beaten the S&P hands over fists over time. But it symbolizes a problem in wealth investing and in building generational wealth. And that's the inevitable drawdown. So in order to get those returns of this triple leveraged QQQ ETF, historically you'd have to endure drawdowns of 80%. 80%. Could you imagine at one point in your investment losing 80% of your investment? Most people can't psychologically handle that. Most people would have already have dumped that investment. And probably rightly so, in order to preserve capital, because who knows if it would even recover. Mathematically, it's very difficult to recover from that kind of loss. Now the S&P 500, people on TikTok are a little younger, people on YouTube might be a little older, but the S&P 500 also has its volatility. And there have been many times over the history of the stock market where there have been drawdowns of close to 50%. So imagine losing 50% of your net worth that you've worked for. And the older you get, the worse it gets, because now you've taken that time to accumulate, you've invested properly, and then you lose 50% of your wealth. So that's where I come in. That's where investment advisors come in. That's where the idea of not just throwing yourself at stuff in a passive index and letting it go comes in, because we control that drawdown. My God, if I had a drawdown of 25%, that's a career ender for a lot of people, because that's not what our job is. Our job is to make consistent returns over time and preserve the capital while we do it. Now, the S&P 500 is a very strong component of it all, and it's a beautiful thing. I use an S&P 500 ETF in my publicly exchange traded fund, and the reason why is because I believe it is a beautiful representation of the broader market, and it is it's the benchmark. And if I'm running a global macro fund with a hedging overlay, then that is what I would be using kind of as a bellwether of performance. Now, as you get more wealthy, you need to preserve more capital. You need to control those drawdowns. I don't know if you've seen my last videos or if you've seen any of my videos, but we talk about the mathematical problem of drawdowns and how over time, if you're going the wrong direction, it compounds and it gets worse. So a 50% drawdown takes 100% to get back to break even. So imagine, not only in the market did you lose 50% of your wealth, but now you need to make 100% of what you originally made back just to get to break even. And that is where the value of a good wealth advisor, fund manager, comes in. And that's what you really need to be thinking about in your wealth building process, is how can I control my risk? And I go over that all the time. I talk to people and I'm like, hey, you look at your portfolio, it looks like you are taking on more risk than what you are willing or probably should be taking. And that's really half of it, is understanding the risk. Most people overestimate how much risk they can take. They're like, oh, I can invest in this crypto, I can invest in this, I can invest long term, I can lock up my stuff, But the thing is, that's only under ideal circumstances. And that's not the truth in most cases. That's an outlier. So you have to keep your risk in mind when you're investing. And in doing so, you have to look at the drawdowns. That's why they originally created that 60-40 portfolio, right? That was hey, this is something that institutions feel comfortable talking to their clients about, because it's 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and they should offset each other. And that's been the case for the longest time. But last year, you were in bonds and you were in stocks, and they all correlated. They all went down. So correlations are a key to controlling risk. And that's really what I do. And that's really the secret to building wealth. Is the secret to building wealth is controlling correlations. It really is controlling your risk while you're accumulating wealth. That's really all it is. People talk about risk reward, people talk about all that, and that's the truth when you simplify it. That's the truth. So look at your portfolio. I want you to go ahead, look at the portfolio, look at what you have. Don't think about what you want to make. Don't think about that. Think about your risk. What are you risking in that portfolio? Is it smart to have 60%, in one thing, or 40% in one thing? Now, if it's a diversified fund of some kind, then, you're getting a little better there. And, and it has different maybe asset classes, things like that. But you really got to look at your portfolio. And you really got to look at wealth building as a risk reward. So to answer your question about the S&P is a great place to start, but you have to look about what you're willing to risk. And if you can find uncorrelated assets or uncorrelated investments that will be going up while the rest of the market's going down, or vice versa, then you're starting to construct a portfolio that's built for wealth preservation, but still gives you the capacity to build wealth over time. Comfortably. That's the key thing, comfortably. I've seen so many people just bail at the worst times. 2008, 2022, 2020. And it's not because investors make the wrong decision. It's because they didn't assess the risk to their portfolios or what can happen. And I cannot hammer this down enough. Look at your portfolio. Make sure it's well diversified. I know you want to go so heavy in tech. I know you want to go so heavy in a certain company. I know you want to go. Don't do it. Don't do it unless you feel you can take that risk. And if you want to take risk, like I said, that triple QQQ. Historically, it's beaten the S&P 500. Will it continue to beat the S&P 500? We don't know. But do you want to sit through an 80% drawdown? Probably not. So that's why the S&P 500 is not just something that you blindly invest in and let it ride. I mean, maybe if you're young, if you're like just being born and your parents are putting money in for you, or you're You've got time. You've got time to recover from a drawdown. But if you have wealth, or if you have a certain amount of wealth, it becomes just as important to preserve your wealth as it is to make money. And I think that's the first kind of wealth building tip I can give.